The wind still moves across the plain the way it did that spring, brushing the surface of Lake Van until the water shivers like a living thing. From the old stone walls, the mountains seem close enough to touch, their shoulders heavy with late snow. In the early light, nothing announces what once unfolded here. Only the silence feels crowded. I speak as the walls of Van speak, as stone that has watched empires press their hands against it. For centuries I faced caravans and armies, banners rising and falling in the same wind. Yet the spring of 1915 settled differently on my towers. The air carried more whispers than trade. By then, the Ottoman Empire was already at war. News traveled slowly, but fear moved faster. In the eastern provinces, suspicion hardened into orders. Armenian villages around the lake heard rumors of arrests in distant towns. Men disappeared in the night. Officials spoke of loyalty and treason in the same breath. Van itself was not merely a city, but a layered memory. Kurdish tribes moved through the hills. Armenian craftsmen shaped wood and stone. Ottoman officers held authority in the citadel. Each community knew the other's festivals and funerals. Coexistence had never been simple, but it had endured. When the arrests began in April, they did not feel like thunder. They felt like a door quietly closing. Community leaders were summoned. Some returned shaken. Some did not return at all. The governor, Cevdet Bey, was said to be enforcing security. His name passed through streets in low voices. Families gathered in courtyards and behind shuttered windows. They argued in hushed tones about whether to flee toward the mountains or remain within the familiar embrace of the city. The roads were uncertain. The countryside was restless. Staying felt dangerous. Leaving felt like surrender to the unknown. In the Armenian quarters, men began to prepare defenses. They were not professional soldiers. Many were artisans, teachers, merchants. They collected rifles where they could, repaired old weapons, rationed ammunition. They knew the Ottoman garrison possessed artillery and trained troops, yet they chose to fortify narrow streets. From my towers, I watched barricades rise from furniture and timber. Women carried stones to reinforce walls. Boys ran messages between districts. There was no grand declaration, no trumpet of rebellion. Only the steady rhythm of hands building something fragile against something vast. The Ottoman forces tightened their presence. Positions were taken around the Armenian neighborhoods. Shots cracked across rooftops. Smoke drifted through the alleys. Official statements called it an uprising. Those inside the barricades called it survival. The language itself fractured, as if words could not hold the weight of what was coming. When the first sustained bombardment began, the lake did not answer. It reflected the smoke without judgment. I felt the tremor of shells against my ancient stones, and I understood that this siege would not be remembered for tactics alone. It would carve its memory into people who had once believed this city was home. The bombardment did not arrive as a single roar, but as a rhythm that settled into daily life. Mornings began with cautious silence, broken by the distant thud of artillery. Dust fell from ceilings long after the explosions faded. Children learned to read the pauses between shots, measuring safety in heartbeats rather than hours. Inside the Armenian quarters, narrow streets became corridors of endurance. Windows were bricked up from the inside. Doorways were reinforced with beams torn from shops and homes. Every household contributed what it could. A rifle here, a sack of grain there, a blanket for the wounded. Nothing felt sufficient, yet nothing was withheld. Food quickly became more valuable than ammunition. Bread was rationed carefully. Wells were guarded. Women organized kitchens in cellars where smoke could be hidden from snipers. Hunger crept in quietly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a steady thinning of faces and patience. Still, no one spoke of surrender without lowering their voice. Ottoman troops advanced cautiously, probing defenses, tightening control over surrounding districts. Reports circulated that villages beyond the city had already suffered mass killings. Whether every detail was true hardly mattered. Fear filled the gaps. The defenders understood that their stand was not only about territory, but about delaying an outcome they dreaded. Across the lake, Russian forces were known to be moving through eastern Anatolia. Some believed relief might come. Others doubted any army would arrive in time. The hope of intervention hovered like a distant shoreline, visible perhaps, but unreachable. Even so, it altered decisions. Endurance gained a purpose. Cevdet Bey's administration framed the fighting as suppression of rebellion. Orders were issued, proclamations posted. The language of authority insisted on restoring order. Yet within the besieged quarters, order had taken a different shape. Committees formed to distribute supplies, assign sentries, and care for orphans already created by the violence. The nights were the hardest. Darkness magnified every sound. Footsteps in an alley could signal an attack. The wounded whispered through their pain so as not to draw attention. In those hours, prayers rose from multiple houses at once, separate voices blending into a single, low murmur that seemed to press against my walls. Some defenders wrote letters they never expected to send. They described the city as it had been only weeks before, markets open, churches ringing, Muslim and Armenian neighbors exchanging greetings. They wrote as if by describing it carefully they could preserve it. Paper became a fragile vault for a vanishing normalcy. There were moments when the firing paused long enough for both sides to hear each other's movement. In those intervals, the siege felt less like a clash of armies and more like a city divided against itself. The same wind crossed both lines. The same mountains watched without choosing a side. As days stretched into weeks, exhaustion replaced the first surge of defiance. Yet the barricades held, not because they were strong, but because those behind them had decided there was nowhere else to stand. And somewhere beyond the smoke, forces were indeed approaching, carrying with them consequences no one fully understood. By mid-May, the sound of distant cannon no longer belonged solely to the Ottoman lines. It carried a different cadence from the north and east, echoing across the water and the hills. Word spread carefully through the barricaded quarters that Russian units were advancing toward the city. Hope returned, but it did not arrive triumphantly. It came with caution. The defenders did not celebrate. They tightened their positions. Ammunition was counted again. Wounded men remained on their pallets, listening to rumors that relief might be hours away or days too late. No one trusted certainty anymore. They had learned how quickly expectation could turn into grief. Ottoman forces began to shift their deployments. Artillery fire became sporadic. then focused on key streets as if marking a final attempt to break resistance. Some soldiers withdrew from outer positions, others dug in. The language of authority softened into urgency. Orders moved quickly through the ranks. Then, almost as quietly as it had begun, the siege loosened its grip. Ottoman troops pulled back from parts of the city as Russian and Armenian volunteer units entered from the outskirts. Smoke still hung in the air, but the direction of power had changed. Barricades that had felt like the last boundary of life were suddenly gates. The moment of relief did not resemble victory. Streets were littered with debris and bodies. Houses stood roofless, interiors exposed like open wounds. Those who emerged from cellars stepped into a city they recognized only by shape. Survival carried no music, only the heavy breath of those who had endured. For a brief time, Armenian administrators assumed control within Van under Russian protection. They attempted to restore order, reopen bakeries, account for the missing. Lists of the dead were written slowly. Churches and public buildings became shelters for families whose homes were destroyed. The city tried to remember how to function. Yet even in this fragile interlude, uncertainty persisted. The wider war raged across Anatolia and the Caucasus. Russian authority was not permanent, it was strategic. Civilians sensed that their fate was tied to distant battlefronts and decisions made far beyond the lake. Relief felt provisional, like a loan that could be recalled. Some who had survived the siege chose to leave immediately, fearing that the shifting lines would return violence to their streets. Caravans formed again, not for trade, but for escape. The mountains that had once framed daily life now became roots of exile. Departure carried its own quiet heartbreak. Others remained, determined to rebuild despite the precariousness. They repaired doors and patched roofs. They planted small gardens in courtyards still scarred by shell fragments. The human instinct to continue asserted itself stubbornly, even when history seemed intent on interruption. I watched the flags change above the city, watched uniforms of different colors occupy the same ground. The stones did not cheer or mourn. They absorbed footsteps, blood, and dust alike. What had been defended at such cost now stood within a larger current of war, and that current had not finished reshaping Van. Summer did not bring calm, it brought distance. As Russian forces pushed deeper into eastern Anatolia, Van became a forward edge rather than a refuge. Supply lines stretched thin. News arrived late and often contradicted itself. Those who had believed the siege marked an ending began to understand it was only an interval in a larger unraveling. By late July of 1915, Ottoman troops advanced again after Russian withdrawals elsewhere on the front. The balance shifted with unsettling speed. Civilians felt the tremor before they heard the guns. Whispers moved through markets and courtyards. The Russians were pulling back. Protection was thinning like smoke in wind. Panic did not erupt all at once, it accumulated. Armenian families who had barely rebuilt their homes now faced a decision harsher than the first: stay and risk retribution, or follow the retreating Russian army toward the Caucasus. The roads north were long and exposed, yet remaining carried a different terror. Columns began to form beyond the city's edges. Women wrapped infants in blankets that could not protect against hunger. Elderly men leaned on staffs, determined not to be left behind. Ox carts creaked under bundles of possessions reduced to what could be carried. The exodus stretched along the shoreline and into the hills. Disease traveled faster than hope. Water grew scarce. Food dwindled. Those who had survived bombardment now faced exhaustion and exposure. Along the routes toward Igdir and the Russian border, bodies were buried hastily or left where they fell. The lake receded behind them, its surface indifferent to departure. Within Van, Ottoman control returned. Administrative authority reasserted itself in familiar buildings. Yet the population had changed dramatically. Armenian neighborhoods stood partially emptied, their doors open to dust and looters. Silence filled streets that had once held barricades and desperate prayer. Kurdish tribes, Ottoman soldiers, and remaining civilians navigated the altered city cautiously. Some sought to claim abandoned property. Others feared retaliation or instability. The war had blurred lines of loyalty and survival. Trust had thinned across communities that once negotiated daily life with uneasy balance. The broader catastrophe unfolding across the empire pressed into Van's memory. Deportations and mass killings of Armenians spread through eastern provinces. What happened here was not isolated, but part of a larger tragedy historians would later name and debate. For those who fled or vanished, labels offered no comfort. If you find yourself pausing here, it is because the mind resists imagining so much displacement in so little time. Yet this was the reality of 1915 in Anatolia. Families uprooted twice within months. Cities changing hands, while ordinary people struggled to remain human. By autumn, the roads out of Van held more footprints than the streets within it. The siege that had once seemed the defining ordeal now felt like a prologue to exile. And the stones that had watched resistance now watched absence, wondering which memory would endure longer. Winter approached the highlands early that year, folding cold air over the plains and hardening the ground around Lake Van. Snow softened the scars of artillery, covering shattered rooftops and abandoned courtyards in a pale quiet. From a distance, the city almost appeared untouched. Only those who remained understood how much had been emptied. The Armenian population that had defended the quarters in spring was now scattered across the Caucasus and beyond. Many reached Russian-controlled territory, exhausted and diminished. Others never completed the journey. Refugee camps formed in unfamiliar towns where language and landscape felt foreign, even though the mountains looked the same. In Van itself, daily life resumed under Ottoman administration, but it moved with restraint. Markets reopened in partial form. Trade caravans hesitated before returning in full. Properties once owned by Armenian families were reassigned, occupied, or left in legal ambiguity. Paperwork attempted to impose order on absence. Survivors who later wrote about the siege did not describe triumph. They described hunger, fear, and the weight of choosing between resistance and flight. Some defended the decision to fight as a necessary stand against annihilation. Others questioned whether any path could have preserved what was lost. Their testimonies resisted simplicity. Military historians would analyze troop movements and strategic timing, noting the Russian advance, the Ottoman withdrawal, the counteroffensive. Yet within the city, the most enduring change was demographic. Van's character shifted, not through a single decree, but through the slow erosion of a community that had lived there for centuries. The Ottoman Empire itself was straining under the wider war. Fronts stretched from Gallipoli to Mesopotamia. Decisions made in distant command centers rippled into towns like Van with devastating intimacy. Civilians felt policies not as proclamations, but as empty seats at tables and locked church doors. Some Muslim residents remembered former neighbors with a quiet complexity rarely captured in official reports. There were accounts of protection offered, of property safeguarded, of regret expressed in private. There were also accounts of complicity and opportunism. Human behavior did not divide neatly along lines of faith or uniform. In later years, political narratives hardened, competing memories formed, each emphasizing different elements of the same events. For some, the siege was proof of rebellion. For others, it was evidence of desperate self-defense within a larger campaign of destruction. Between these poles lay individual stories too fragile for slogans. If you are still listening in this moment, it is because history sometimes asks us to remain present even when resolution is absent. The siege of Van refuses easy moral framing. It exists in the tension between fear and survival, between authority and vulnerability. As the war dragged toward its eventual end and the Ottoman Empire moved toward dissolution, Van stood altered. Its stones remained, its lake continued to shimmer beneath changing skies, but the texture of its life had shifted. What had been defended, abandoned, and reclaimed would never fully return to its former shape. Years passed and empires dissolved. The Ottoman state that had governed Van through war and suspicion gave way to the modern Republic of Turkey. Borders shifted, maps were redrawn. Yet the lake remained where it had always been, reflecting a sky that did not remember the arguments of men. Those who fled rarely returned. Many Armenian survivors built new lives in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in Europe, carrying Van in stories told to children who had never seen its walls. Memory became portable. It traveled farther than any army had, settling into letters, memoirs, and quiet family rituals. In Van, new generations grew up among structures whose origins they did not always question. Houses changed hands, streets were renamed. The Armenian churches that survived stood altered or silent. Layers of identity were not erased completely, but they were rearranged, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through neglect. Historians would later examine archives from Ottoman officials, Russian commanders, missionaries, and survivors. They would debate intent, scale, and responsibility. The siege itself would be placed within the broader catastrophe of 1915, studied as one episode among many in a year that reshaped Anatolia irrevocably. Yet beyond documents and diplomatic language, there remained the simpler truth of ordinary lives interrupted. A craftsman who once carved wood near the marketplace did not return to his tools. A teacher who had memorized poetry for her students vanished along the road north. These absences did not require interpretation to be felt. The walls of Van still hold the marks of projectiles, though time has worn them smooth. Visitors walk along the ruins of the ancient citadel and gaze over the blue expanse of the lake. Few can imagine the weeks when smoke darkened that same horizon. The silence today feels natural, but it was once contested. In the broader arc of the First World War, the siege of Van may appear as a localized conflict, a strategic point along the Eastern Front. But for those who endured it,
It was the axis around which their world broke. Strategy meant little compared to the immediate question of whether morning would come. Memory in this region is not uniform. For some, Van symbolizes defense against imperial collapse. For others, it stands as testimony to persecution and survival. These narratives coexist uneasily, shaped by national identity and inherited grief. The lake reflects them all without preference. If there is any lesson carried forward, it is not one of victory or defeat. It is the recognition that cities remember in ways people often struggle to accept. Stones outlast arguments. Landscapes absorb suffering and continue, leaving it to later generations to decide what to acknowledge. And so the wind continues across the plain, touching the ruins and the water alike. It carries no verdict, only movement. The siege that once seemed to define Van now rests within a longer continuum of memory, unresolved yet enduring, like the lake itself under an unchanging sky.